Okay, welcome everybody to our final session for this semester of our History at Newcastle seminar series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded traditional lands of the Pamalong clan of the Wabaco Nation and pay respect to elders past and present. It is my absolute pleasure to wrap up our series with our colleague in ancient history, Nicole Kimball, who is an associate lecturer in ancient history and is teaching into many of our courses and is just an all-around fantastic researcher and educator. So Nicole is currently completing her final minor revisions to her PhD thesis and will be very soon awarded that coveted title of doctor. Let's see, I don't actually have your thesis title, but it is on the reception of witchcraft in the ancient, medieval, and even contemporary literature. So today, however, she is here to talk to us about abjection and anxiety, the metamorphosis of the Roman literary witch. So with that, I will go ahead and start sharing the screen and pass it off to Nicole, who will wow us with her talk.
Awesome. Yep, we're all good. Thank you.
Just a little bit. There you go. So see you.
I'm just gonna it's not a switch. Just down here. No, that's fine. That works. All right. Just on sort of that note, this is actually the second chapter of my thesis. This is based on, and I've sort of pulled bits and pieces out of that to make it small enough to fit into 45 minutes to an hour. All right, so marked by her power, her subversion of gender roles, and her unsettling otherness, the witch is a distinctive figure that's continually been the subject of fascination in Western culture, going so far back as Greece, Rome, and earlier. And as each culture creates imagery and iconography surrounding their idea of the witch, that imagery evolves. And the imagery used by the late Republican and Early Imperial poets and philosophers of Rome showed a marked increase in the abject across both their appearance and behaviour, particularly as compared to their Greek counterparts. They're primarily portrayed as old women and already on the margins of Roman society. These witches evolved to be crueler, uglier, and exponentially more vicious. And in order to draw out this evolution, I draw on late 20th century accounts of the abject to demonstrate how such a defining characteristic illuminates Roman attitudes towards magic and its female practitioners, however fantastical they may be in this period. So given the importance of the role of the abject in definitions of the Roman witch, I'm turning to the work of Kimberly B. Stratton, and this paper builds on her examination of the abject in conjunction with Roman concepts of magic and magical practice as they appear in literature, and then builds on her work in new areas. So Stratton argues that the objectionary motifs that we see in Roman literary depictions of magic express anxiety over controlling the stability and boundaries of the body, thus linking magic with objection in the context of Roman corporal ideology. Furthermore, she suggests that the theory of objection, which I'll get to in a moment, goes to some way to explaining the disproportionate appearance of female magical practitioners in Roman literature as compared to reality. Women's bodies, particularly that of the mother, are already frequently associated with objection, and thus these gendered portraits help communicate the abject quality of magic. Now, while I agree with Stratton that the motifs surrounding Roman images of witchcraft express anxiety, and that the theory of objection can be a useful tool in examining this, I argue that these expressions of anxiety should not be solely aligned with women's bodies. It's my suggestion that the Roman authors examined in this chapter were deliberately using the image of the witch as the Romans understood her and the associated undesirableness of magic to attack people or personas, largely female, who they felt to be undesirable. Their abject imagery projected their disgust and dislike of these undesirable individuals as a form of invective literature, communicating the author's rejection of that individual, but also attempting to justify this reaction on a larger social scale. So the theory of abjection, it's a fun one. It's both really, really simple and really, really complex. But it explores the relational experiences between subject and object. So it actually originates in the Latin absere, to throw away or cast off or out. And in English, the adjective abject has two meanings. The first denotes something extremely unpleasant or degrading, and the second describes something that is entirely without pride or dignity. As a theoretical concept, abjection falls between these two definitions, encompassing both the encounter with the unpleasant or abject stimulus and the instinctive reaction to reject it. So as Rena Ayer notes, the terms abject and abjection can be used in different but related senses to refer to an operation, so to make something abject, and a condition which is to be abject or objection. In the first sense, abjection refers to an impulse or operation to reject that which disturbs or threatens the stability of the self and is unassimilable. Secondly, it refers to the wretched condition of being in this state when one has experienced the abject or been rendered abject. So this is something that you can experience yourself, or it is something that someone else can sort of push on you. And Ayer's observation highlights an important aspect of the concept of abjection. While abjection as an operation is constructive in that it seeks to stabilize the subject and its relationship with the world, the experience of being rendered abject is inherently destructive. It highlights a complex and integral relationship the concept of abjection has with the subject. Moreover, it forces the subject to acknowledge its otherness. In rejecting the other, the subject is also rejected and the sense of self is damaged. So in psychoanalysis, which is where you generally see this theory most often, abjection describes the reaction, which is often visceral or physical, to a threatened breakdown in meaning caused by the loss of distinction between subject and object, or between self and other. And as we see below, this makes the theory of abjection particularly suited to the examination of Roman witchcraft. The witches examined here are seen as a threat either to the ego of those that write about them, or in some cases to the order of the social system they find themselves in. Moreover, through their magic, all of them are presented as a threat to the mental or bodily integrity of their victims. At a social level, abjection works in much the same way as it does on the physical level. Fear and rejection of the other are still central. However, social abjection replaces the egocentricity of psychoanalysis with the dominant social cultural dynamics of the society. Thus, the subject I becomes hegemonic social expectations, while other becomes anything that threatens that hegemony. Interestingly, racism also falls in this. Individuals or groups on the fringes of society who are stigmatized over differences are seen as a threat to the fabric of society, even as they occupy an integral position within it. Abject in their otherness, these individuals and groups populate what Judith Butler calls the zone of inhabitability, and thus are seen as dirty or contaminating with the potential to consume and restructure social hegemony. It's not surprising that magic would be relegated to this zone. The Romans felt that the very nature of magic was parasitic, and so were the people who used it. And we see this in the depictions of the witches below. At the borders of society, the witch preys on others for her own benefit, rather than what the poet and philosopher determined to be the social good. Not always actually the social good, but in response, the poet and philosopher reject her and use abject imagery to justify their reaction. So I don't think this was a new slide. So although Roman witches of Roman literature are a very eclectic mix, we can nonetheless actually put them into three very broad categories. The first of these are the witches imported from Greece and adopted into the Roman literary corpus, primarily Circe and Medea. Both Circe and Medea were adapted to be more specifically suited to Roman ideals and are increasingly shown in a negative light. By contrast, the second category of witch, unique to Latin love elegy, combines the witch with the drunken bawd, a mature female figure who corrupts the lover poet's girl and throws obstacles between them. A mix of old drunken women and brothel madams, these witches are thought to be the most indicative of reality. You'll probably find these very interesting. The third type, the hag witch, is a combination of the two, displaying the physical characteristics of the bawd witch with the power of Circe and Medea. It's in this category we find the Roman arch witches, Canidia and Erictho. Now, these groups do share a series of common motifs, including a preoccupation with erotic magic, control of the landscape elements and heavenly bodies, including both the sun and the moon, the evocation and control of the dead, the gathering of magical ingredients, often noxious herbs and human body parts, and the ability to shapeshift. And although not all these features are present in every case, as a group, they present a terrifying abject figure who challenges not only the social and individual bodies, but also the natural order of things. So I'm going to go through each different type of witch, but I'm going to start with the Greek witch. Oh, no, there we go. I did have another slide for that. So there's my sort of categories and sort of where you find them. Interestingly, the bawd witch, completely unique to Latin love elegy, you very rarely find her anywhere else. And if you do, she's either usually in this category or they've turned either Circe or Medea into a bawd witch. So, the Greek witch. In the final 2 centuries BC, the conquest of Greece by Rome brought about the transformation of Roman culture from everyday life to mythology. Poets and writers of Augustan early imperial Rome, with its desire to incorporate and recast the experience and culture of the past into distinctly Roman terms, expressed a natural inclination to blend Greek myth with Roman legend, an inclination that extended to the importation of witch figures in the forms of Circe and Medea. So Circe appears in both Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphosis, where she was adapted to each poet's individual epic style. Equally, Medea was adapted across several genres, including epic and elegy in Ovid's Metamorphosis and Heroides, as well as Roman drama in Seneca's tragic play Medea. However, as a nod to constraints of time today, I'm only going to be talking about Circe. So first, as we see her in Ovid, Ovid's version of Circe retains her Homeric complexity. In her sort of Greek incarnation, she's probably closest to what we would call an anti-hero, but she is a very, very complex character, which allows Ovid to take advantage of her as an already troublesome figure. She is what Kristeva might describe as the in-between, the ambiguous, and the composite, and already positioned as an abject figure. Ovid, as I said, takes advantage of this, highlighting Circe's in-between nature through her surroundings. Excuse me. We see this in the Ulysses episode of the Metamorphosis. So for those of you who aren't aware, Ulysses is the Roman name for Odysseus. So that's the name I'm going to be using. Where we are introduced to a deliberately juxtaposed image. So in one moment, we are shown a powerful, wild figure, reminiscent, so capable of enchanting hundreds of wolves, lionesses, and she-bears. So we have that in that first passage. As soon as they reach Circe's island and her home, they're surrounded by hundreds of wolves, lionesses, she-bears, but these animals are not harming them. They're actually quite friendly, which for wild animals is very odd. So this image is actually reminiscent of Homer's Circe and her links to the pot near Theron. But this first introduction in Ovid's Met shows her ability to pervert the natural order, already again marking her as an abject figure. And it is directly followed by a very different image of Circe holding court over her nymph and nereid retainers, as she oversees a sort of industrial potion-making operation, which is on the second side. So they're not carding wool or fleece as you would expect of a Roman household, but instead sorting out grasses and herbs and such into baskets ready to make various potions. So Ovid's comparison here shows the border between civilized and uncivilized, between the wild and the domestic. The wild animals are domesticated and even friendly. Circe's ladies do not work wool as proper Roman women should, instead working with herbs and potions. So Ovid's Circe does not just symbolize the border between us and them, she actually straddles it, highlighting not just herself as an abject figure, but her entire island as liminal space. And of course, Ovid's image of Circe is not just based on this one scene. He makes it exceptionally clear that he has based his interpretation of Circe on the trope of the woman scorned, describing her as possessing a heart more open to others, to love's strong flames. From her first introduction in his epic, Ovid links Circe to the intrinsic preoccupation with erotic magic and love spells characteristic of Roman witches. To Ovid, Circe's magic is an extension of her susceptibility to desire, power over men, and her dangerous sexual jealousy and anger. And Ovid makes this clear in 2 of the 3 episodes in which Circe appears. So I didn't put these ones up because it is a lot of text. So the episode with Glaucus and Scylla in book 14, and with Picus at the beginning of book 14, and Picus and Canaans not long after. So in the first, having been approached by Glaucus for help with seducing the nymph Scylla, Circe instead offers herself as a lover and is rejected. Jealous, she poisons Scylla's bathing pool, transforming her into the terrifying monster of the Odyssey. For those of you who don't know, the poison transforms Scylla's lower body. She ends up with dog heads around her waist, and it's generally just a horrific image. And then Circe's reaction to rejection is repeated in the episode with Picus. Upon seeing him in the woods, Circe is love-struck. She separates him from his men and professes her love. Picus, however, is in love with Canaans and rejects her advances. Circe reacts by transforming him into a woodpecker. On each occasion, Circe demonstrates the Roman witch's preoccupation with love, or at least sexual attraction. Moreover, she demonstrates the Roman witch's propensity to interfere in relationships in a way that benefits her, whether by making her competition undesirable or avenging herself upon an unfaithful lover, however unfaithful that lover actually is. And then in the 3rd episode of the Metamorphosis, in which Ovid tells his version of the encounter between Circe and Ulysses, also demonstrates Circe's sexuality and power over men. So it's not until Ulysses agrees to her seduction that she graciously restores him to human shape. Segal argues that Ulysses treats this encounter only as a means to his companion's freedom. He submits, not out of any attraction to Circe, but in a business-like transaction, which gets them both what they want. What Segal does not account for is the glaring absence of the Homeric Odysseus's demand that Circe not unman him in the process. Ovid's Ulysses insists only on his man being restored, asking no protection for himself before joining fair Circe in bed. His behaviour suggests that in this scene, and contrary to normal Roman social convention, Circe has all the power in the relationship. Sexually aggressive and socially dominant, Circe threatens the basic patriarchal hierarchy of Roman social structure. So there we have sort of Circe cursing or poisoning Scylla's bathing water, turning Picus into a woodpecker, and then over here we have Circe and Ulysses. I did not mark the slide. There we go. So while Ovid renders Circe abject as a figure, it's her power of transformation that actually places her within the realm of abjection. They blur the line between human and non-human, a fact that Ovid is very, very careful to emphasize. And we see this, for example, in the account of one of Ulysses' men, Marsyas, who describes the feeling of being turned into a pig. So he says, I started to prickle all over with bristles. My voice had deserted me. All the words I could utter were snorting grunts. I was falling down to the earth head first. I could feel my nose and my mouth going hard in a long round snout. My neck was swelling in form of muscle, and the hands which had lifted the cup just now to my lips were marking the soil with hoof prints. So through the detail of Marsyas' transformation, we are confronted with the fragility of the human body and how artificial the distinction between humans and animals can be. However, Ovid's emphasis is not just on the horror of this transformation. In giving us Marsyas' account, Ovid forces us to realize that Marsyas was aware of his own humanity while this was happening. we are confronted by the idea of the human psyche trapped in the body of an animal, aware but unable to communicate. A reminder only reinforced by the transformation of Picus, who can only vent his rage at Circe through pecking at trees as a woodpecker. And of course, Circe's transformative power does not just apply to people. Ovid shows her power over the landscape, and thus the natural order, just as effectively. So we have here Circe is transforming the forest around her. So wonder of wonders, the woods all jumped, the earth gave a rumbling groan, and the trees in the glade turned yellow. The poison-besotted grass was running with blood, and it appeared that the rocks were hoarsely bellowing, dogs were barking, the earth was crawling with rough-scaled serpents as black as the night. The air was filled with the flitting ghosts of the silent departed. I need to hurry this up. So Ovid's vivid description demonstrates the breadth of Circe's power. The landscape with its poison-spattered grass and bellowing rocks had become repulsive, transformed into a terrifying amalgamation of bodily fluids, poisonous substances, and unnatural occurrences. Moreover, in summoning ghosts, Circe's turned the forest landscape, already liminal in a transformative place, into one associated with death and the underworld. Circe has disturbed the natural order, highlighting the fragility of nature and its susceptibility to the unnatural. Circe then, as well in being rendered abject, is a facilitator of abject experience. And then I'm going to move on to the bawd witch. Here's my next time. So the bawd witch, as I said, is a common subject of the elegiac poets, and these figures offer a contemporary Roman image of how a witch might look or act. Old and often drunk, with thinning hair and wrinkled skin. Moreover, this bawd witch is generally concerned with erotic magic, and is such often characterized as either an aging prostitute or procuress. And it's not surprising that prostitutes and procuresses would be considered adepts in the use of erotic magic, and certainly some proficiency would have been necessary, particularly in the more aggressive agogo spells. So those spells that involve the feeling of burning or being tortured with love or desire. So if you're a Roman citizen looking for erotic magic, a prostitute is generally the first place you look. And the idea that old women might be connected with alcoholism was not a novel one either. As Dickey notes, the prejudice against women drinking wine can be traced back to the early 2nd century BC. The litany of examples of the prejudice is extensive. The drunken procuress is a common figure in the plays of Plautus and Menander, while Cato the Elder, Polybius, and Cicero all remark on the fact that upstanding Roman women do not drink undiluted wine. And the striking aspect of these women is that then these marginal figures, made abject by their exclusion from dominant society, are made more so by the attribution of other characteristics that go far beyond erotic magic or drunkenness. And I love that picture there, but it is incredibly phallic. That is a wine jar she is holding, just to make that very clear. I can't help but think it's done that way on purpose, but it is a wine jar. So an example of this type of witch can be again seen in Ovid's collection of elegiac poems, the Amores. In Amores 1.8, Ovid tells us how his lover is being pulled away for him by Dipsys, a procuress, Lena, whom he describes as old, anus, and such a drunk that the rosy dawn has never seen her sober. Moreover, he immediately describes her as a witch. So we learn her name, that she's a drunk, and then she's a witch. And we see in this passage all the common motifs of the Roman witch. Dipsys is able to guarantee the weather, control the flow of water, the stars and the moon, and raise the dead. She has a predisposition for erotic magic, being a brewer of aphrodisiacs. Interestingly, Dipsys also has some talent with the rhombus, which is the Roman version of the Yinx wheel, also used by a Greek witch in Theocritus' Pharmacoutria. And while it's unclear whether this is a direct reference to Theocritus, the inclusion of the rhombus suggests that even in more native Roman witches, elements of Greek magic are being adapted and incorporated. So Propertius and Tibullus also describe similar women, elderly procuresses who tempt the poet's lover towards a wealthy paramour. Both Propertius' acanthus and Tibullus' 2 unnamed bawds are able to control the moon and inflict or suppress love. Indeed, according to Propertius, Acanthus is so good at this, she is able to disrupt a magnet's power to attract iron. Like Dipsys, Acanthus is able to turn herself into an animal, this time a wolf, while one of Tibullus' bawds knows all Medea's evil herbs. And while they're not quite as comprehensive in their description as Ovid, Propertius and Tibullus both include common motifs associated with the Roman witch. Notably, Tibullus' reference to Medea further suggests that Greek imagery is being incorporated into specifically Roman ideas of witchcraft. Like Circe, all three figures evoke the abject in their disregard for the natural process, as well as the bodily and mental integrity of others. Their abilities are used to mark these women as both other and threatening. They are, on one level, a threat to the mental integrity and self-worth of the women they seek to influence, pulled away from their own goals, so the relationship with the lover poet, in favour of the wealthy lovers to whom the bawd intends them. On another level, the bawd represents a threat to the lover poet's sense of self. Her influence calls into question the lover poet's worthiness as a lover and success as a Roman man, as his lover has been drawn away to someone more successful. Offended, the lover poet in each case violently rejects the bawd, cursing her with a series of unpleasant characteristics and experiences. So Ovid is perhaps the calmest in his reaction, simply re-emphasizing Dipsys' age and drunkenness, before wishing her nowhere to live, a penniless old age, chronic winters, and an insatiable thirst. Propertius also wishes an incurable thirst in Acanthus before wishing her tomb would be an ancient wine jar with a chipped neck. Ovid and Propertius are both clearly referencing the images of the bawd as a drunk old woman and thus use associated imagery, insatiable thirst or the damaged wine jar. Notably, these curses do not actually evoke any feeling of objection as caused by the bawd witch. Instead, in his detailed rejection, the lover poet renders her abject. The distinction is small but important, and most effectively seen in the two very different approaches we see in Tibullus' description of his two witches. The first of these, the one on the left, is in Elegy 1.5, where Tibullus introduces Achelida Lena, a cunning bawd, to whom he believes to be using magic to turn his lover away from him. Unlike Propertius and Ovid, Tibullus' list of characteristics reference witch imagery over that of the drunken old woman, although it is taken to the extreme. Line 51 refers to the practice of necromancy, while lines 53 and 54 connect her to the harvesting of herbs and bones for spells. Finally, lines 52 and 55 reference the witch's ability to shapeshift, as we see with Dipsys and Acanthus. Moreover, Tibullus' image is so effective that by line 59, the Lena has become a saga, a witch. Notably, these characteristics do not actually describe the Lena Tibullus is speaking of, instead taking the shape, as with Ovid and Propertius, of what amounts to a curse on his own part. This equation between bawd and witch is one entirely constructed by the poet as an attempt to remove her influence over his lover and thus remove the threat to his own ego. Tibullus thus renders her abject rather than allowing her to evoke feelings of abjection. And what is particularly interesting is that this representation of the bawd is entirely opposite to his second witch, as found in Elegy 1.2. So again, we have all the imagery associated with the Roman witch, and this time the witch herself is the one to induce objection. However, Tibullus himself does not reject her. He does not render her abject. Instead, he welcomes her power because it's useful to him. What this suggests in the case of representation of Roman witchcraft is there are actually two very different approaches taken by Roman writers, although they are often in use at the same time. The first of these is, of course, the abject nature of the witch herself. With her ability to pervert nature, change her shape, and impinge on the bodily and mental integrity of others, the bawd witch is a frightening and powerful figure. And this is the point. Ascribing these women such fantastic powers, the lover is able to justify the impact she has on his own sense of self. The more powerful the bawd appears, the more effective her magic, and thus the more acceptable it is to be threatened. The second approach is then to render these women abject, whether they are witches or not. And being compared to the improperly buried dead, as we see in Ovid and Propertius, or a rabid dog, as we see in Tibullus, the bawd is rendered an object of disgust, and thus is worthy of being rejected from society, removing her influence over the poet's lovers. Moreover, Lindsay Watson suggests that the authors of accounts of witchcraft are plainly here debunking magic as an illusory, corrosive superstition, noting that the magic that has been recorded is often unsuccessful, especially when performed by these elderly witches. Thus, in rendering the bawd abject, the lover poet is able to not only remove her influence from the social hierarchy, but also cast doubt on the overall purpose of magic. And then we move on to our final witch. I love that picture. It's great. So this is the final type of witch we see in Roman literature, and it's the one that came to dominate the Roman tradition and then moving into the medieval. The hag witch. Of characteristics taken from the bawd and the imported Greek witch. This witch often shows the physicality of the bawd witch mixed with the power associated with Circe and Medea. It's in these witches that the Romans fully adopted the idea of the abject witch, creating a figure who was socially and physically abject in every way. And we see this figure embodied in the figures of Horace's Canidia, who appears in several of his poems, and Lucan's Erictho, the arch-witch of his epic poem, the Pharsalia. However, once again, for reasons of time, I'm sticking with Canidia today. So Canidia's first appearance in Horace's work occurs in Satire 1.8. The poem is told from the perspective of a statue of Priapus, who has been set to guard a new park built on the Esquiline Hill. He recounts how one night Canidia and her associate Sagana entered the park with the intention of casting spells. As Stratton notes, the park itself is already an abject place, built, as Priapus tells us, over a corpus cemetery. So Priapus tells us that not long ago, slaves arranged for the corpses of their fellows to be carried here in cheap boxes after their bodies had been hurled from their narrow cells. This place served as a common grave for the poor mob, for Pantabilius the rake and Nomentus the playboy, a plot 1,000 feet in front and another 300 back. And according to this marker, the monument is not to pass to the heirs. Yet now you can live here on Esquiline Hill, a wholesome place, to walk the sunny promenade where just recently mourners looked upon grounds misshapen by wine and bones. Maxwell Paul notes that the gardens are a liminal space. Although works have been completed to convert the cemetery into gardens, the transition is new and the boundaries of the location are uncertain. The garden has not solidified in the poet's consciousness, and such being still both the garden and the cemetery. Horace takes advantage of this, comparing the sunny gardens to the grim landscape of the cemetery, effectively creating a landscape of danger and anxiety. The images of slaves carrying corpses to the cemetery is disturbing, and Horace's emphasis on its size is equally uncanny. Most frightening, however, is the implication that the bodies are improperly buried, leaving them visible from the surface and thus able to pollute the garden with miasma. The landscape of the garden has been entwined with death, linking to the abjection of the corpse. As Marguerite Johnson says, the imagery of the abject has now begun. Horace's witches, like the park they've invaded, are also intrinsically linked to the corpse. They are described as old women, barefoot and dishevelled, while Canidia has false teeth and Sagana wears a wig. Finally, their pale colouring makes them hideous to view. Beyond their being old and ugly, Julia Doroszewska, I think is how you say that, suggests that the appearance of the witches, especially their pallor and advanced age, makes them resemble the ghosts they converse with, emphasising their liminal status as creatures half human, half demonic, or half living, half dead. Horace also takes the imagery further, presenting his witches as bestial, not just wishing them so, as we see in Pholus. Canidia and Sagana scrape at the soil with their nails, before sacrificing a lamb using their teeth, much as a dog or wolf might bring down prey. Unlike the bawd witch, who transforms into an animal, Canidia and Sagana are animals in their behaviour. So this is Horace here. Their disregard for social and religious norms and procedures is so complete they do not feel the need to transform into an animal before behaving like one. Notably, we actually see a direct reception of a Greek text in Horace's work here. So the pit ritual that Horace uses to show the bestial natures of his witches is taken directly from the Odyssey, in which Odysseus sacrifices a ram in a pit in order to summon the ghost of the prophet Tiresias. So, according to Homer, now when with sacrifices and prayers I had so entreated the hordes of the dead, I took the sheep and cut their throats over the pit, and the dark-coloured blood, dark clouding blood ran in, and the souls of the perished dead gathered to the place. And this is compared to what we find in Horace. So they began to scratch at the earth with their nails. They ripped apart a black lamb with their teeth. The gore they poured into a ditch to summon the spirits from ghosts to answer their questions. In using this direct reference to Homer, Horace, whose audience would have been intimately aware of the Odyssey, is able to juxtapose his witches against the proper religious observance performed by Odysseus, emphasizing their animalistic violence. Thus, in this portrait, Horace's witches have no bodily integrity or stability. Instead, they flow between human, corpse, and animal, an extreme image of physical abjection. Moreover, Odysseus's necromantic ritual, while technically magic, is framed by Homer as a religious observance and a necessary part of his journey as a hero. He also technically has the approval of a god to do what he does. In comparison, Canidia's actions are selfish and unnecessary. She wishes to know the future without consulting the proper religious authorities. Horace is here casting judgment not only on Canidia, but also the practice of witchcraft in general. Yes, I did. The second poem in which she appears, Epode 5, presents Canidia as an even more ghastly figure. Joined by Sagana and two other witches, Thea and Folia, Canidia murders a young boy, intending to use his liver and bone marrow as aphrodisiacs. Here we see the connection to erotic magic that was a key element of Roman witchcraft. However, unlike the bawd witch or even Circe and Medea, Canidia represents the extreme end of Roman concerns about magic and the social position of older women. Both Canidia and her magical practice are represented as drains on society without contributing to their common good. So Horace continues to connect the witches' landscape with death as he tells us how they transform their surroundings to suit their purposes. So Canidia commanded them to dig out fig trees from the graves, to bring her funeral cypresses, to gather eggs and feathers of the screech owl, bird of night, and soak them in the blood of loathsome toads, to pick whatever herbs Iolcus grows, and poison rich Hiberia, and rip the bones from starving bitches' jaws, and burn all this on Colchian fires. Fig trees and cypresses often grew in Roman graveyards, and branches of cypress were often placed outside a house to indicate death. Here, their purpose is twofold: to signify the boy's approaching death, and to create an abject landscape explicitly connected to the underworld. Horace furthers this connection in the next two lines, in which Sagana is sprinkling waters of the Avernus about the house. Lake Avernus, a volcanic lake found in Campania to the southwest of Rome, was thought to be an entrance to the underworld. In this case, rather than going to an abject location as they did in the graveyard, and where, considering the length of time needed to starve the boy to death, they might be caught, the witches have instead created a landscape in which death supplants life. Canidia's act of murder also highlights her abjection, much in the same way as Medea is rendered abject through her own murderous spree. As Stratton notes, murdering a boy to make an old hag's love potion evokes horror for its cruelty combined with its trite banality. In destroying the youth for the benefit of her own aged and presumably post-childbearing body, Canidia embodies the existential threat that old women represent to society. She is, quite literally, a drain on the precious resources for the future of failing to commit to the common good. Moreover, Horace is actually playing on what appears to be an established concern among the Roman populace. Petronius Satyricon also mentions a child taken by witches, although he does not mention for what purpose. And this aspect of the witch was also captured on a child's epitaph, whose inscription indicates that the child was stolen and presumably killed by witches. So Horace's witches equate a living child with a potion ingredient, denying him both his life and his humanity, thereby rendering him abject. To Canidia and her associates, the boy is no different to the bones gathered from the graveyard in Satire 1.8. Although his transformation is not literal, the boy is transformed nonetheless. The witches, therefore, are not only able to disrupt the social fabric by the way of infanticide, but also, like Circe, to disrupt the sense of self through transformation from human to non-human, living to dead. So the literary witches of the late Republican and early Imperial periods reflected some of the most deep-seated and long-standing fears among Roman men, the threat posed by old women with secret powers. The early incarnations of these women exposed the anxieties around magic and the potential threat it posed already present in the Roman psyche, particularly those anxieties around bodily integrity and social hegemony. As these anxieties around magic grew, the literary representations of magic were pushed back into this marginalized group of women. Witches, previously facilitators of abject experience, became abject in their appearance and their actions, a metamorphosis that leads from Circe to Erictho.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you very much.
Didn't time that too badly either.
Well done.
I've never done one that long before, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, you've given us plenty of time. We got 10 minutes plus for questions, so yeah, we'll open it up to the floor. Yeah, Sasha.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And from my own sort of research, I was struck by the number of sort of points of comparison with the sort of demonization in the early modern period of sort of Romani women. You know, again, with associations with magic, with bawdiness, and so on. One of the features that comes up in that context specifically is the eating of carrion. And I'm just wondering if you see similar things in the period you're looking at, or if that's come in later on.
Unfortunately, with sort of the space or time I had, you actually see a lot of that with Erictho. So she is probably by far the most abject witch used. So she lives in a cemetery. She absolutely, like she, I think Lucan says she takes an unborn child from a prostitute's corpse. She desecrates the dead. She will bite off fingers and toes rather than sort of using scissors to get it. Like, so it's definitely there. But it's really interesting that they sort of get to Erictho, she's the worst, and then it just kind of dies off a bit.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, thank you. But in that context, it's sort of associated with cannibalism specifically.
Yeah, so
right?
Erictho definitely those cannibalistic elements, less so with the others, but even Canidia, like there's elements of it there, particularly with the boy. Presumably someone's going to drink this potion.
Right, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Kathy.
Thanks, Nicole. Really interesting and such rich textual material that you're dealing with. So you might expect a question like this from me, but I'm really curious about the relationship between the text and the social and political world, and whether or not there's a kind of practical impact of these words and ideas of abjection in terms of women themselves, how they were policed, that kind of thing. You may not have been able to do that.
It's more likely a reflection rather than an out and out attack. In saying that, there is some debate over whether Canidia is actually based on a real person, a woman that Horace really did not get along with. So certainly, and elegiac poetry in general is very, very often used to attack people that the poet doesn't like. So whether it's sort of directed at singular people or women in general, it's probably a bit of both, but not really to a sort of massive extent. Even sort of the most political of them being, again, Lucan's Erictho. So Lucan is actually, he's writing about the increasing degeneracy of the Roman Empire under Nero via the Battle of Pharsalia between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. And one of the ways he sort of really has a go at Pompey's son Sextus is this sort of interaction with Erictho and sort of going, not only are you not going to see a priest to find out the future like you probably should be doing, you're actually going to the most degenerate, the most disgusting, like literally the most reprehensible person that you can find. Not only is she a Thessalian witch, she is the worst of all of them. And it's sort of it's a point in the book where it really is emphasizing how bad Rome has gotten, and Lucan is actually killed for what he wrote.
Okay, that's a great answer. And because my head was also going to the early modern period, because I did some work in my early career on widows, for example, in 17th century England. And so by then you get this actual social exclusion, political, legal exclusion of women in different ways. So that's what I find really interesting about the pattern.
Yeah, one of the things I've sort of found across sort of all my research is that witches pop up in terms of times of turmoil is where you start getting all these literary texts, and it's an easy way to make someone a scapegoat.
On a related note to that, I would have to ask, would this be an example of, for example, setting up a woman in the case of the classic Roman situation of the patriarch, you know, literal power over life and death, infants and whatnot, birth and everything, and power over the family? Would this also potentially be used as an example of if you let a woman have these powers, it's like a reflection of the Roman patriarch?
Potentially. So again, it is a period where a lot of women are gaining a lot of power that traditionally they wouldn't have had. But it's not quite as specific as that. Generally, those women, they weren't calling them witches. They would call them other things. So sort of you see a lot of that in Catullus's writing in particular. He is incredibly vulgar when he is writing about people he doesn't like, or with his Lesbia who rejects him once you sort of get to that point. The shift in the way he's writing about her, but it's almost always just calling her a whore rather than a witch. So it's sort of like there's this extra step with these people, but also Lesbia was supposed to be quite a powerful person. So there's sort of going to be some sort of censorship there in this is going too far.
I might step in. So I was really struck by that, excuse me, that scene of the sacrifice to learn the future. You know, and obviously the sort of Homeric reference and the kind of corruption of that. But it's also interesting, I think, the Romans loved doing sacrifices to predict the future, to sort of see into the future. There's this, it's interesting that there's sort of an illicit way, through the priesthood, and this sort of illicit way that's using similar methods, but, one is sort of sanctioned while the other is considered corrupt.
Yeah, and it actually sort of reflects magic in general as well. So a lot of what is considered magic, if it's performed by a priest, it's not magic,
Right.
It's religion. So there is this really, really sort of strong crossover as to who's actually performing the ceremony or the whatever is really important, particularly when it comes to divination.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in one breath, divination is just standard operating procedure. It's, like any other science or art, but witchcraft, however, is sort of dark.
Yeah.
Even though they're accomplishing very similar things by the same method, it's really, kind of
Yeah.
interesting insights into the Roman psyche. Other questions?
I'm just in your comment just now, Nicole, how church sacrifices male clergy. Of course, they could justify what they were doing as being the right way, whereas women in this time, it's easy to cast them as horrid as you wanted because they had no platform in which to respond that was going to be heard in a patriarchal society.
Well, there's actually a really, really good example in a much, much later text, early modern European one, the Malleus Maleficarum. There's this really, really fun bit sort of towards the middle of it where they talk about witches stealing men's penises and keeping them in trees. Yeah, but right at the beginning of that section, there is a bishop who actually gives his penis to his angel, to an angel as part of his vow of chastity. And because it's voluntary and it's a man doing it, it's okay. But when a woman does it, it's not okay. And there is, of course, that implication that she's just gone and stolen all of his penises. And the joke here is that the local priest comes and asks her for one and he wants the biggest. So like there's some dirty jokes in there, but it's really interesting that you sort of have the two essentially quite similar images, but they're very, very different in tone.
Any final questions? Anybody from the Zoom chat want to chime in at all? All right, well, we might thank Nicole one more time. A wonderful send off to a wonderful seminar series this semester. So this is our final seminar series. I am finalizing semester 2's lineup. I promise it's going to be another kicker, so keep an eye out on your emails for that. But in the meantime, enjoy the break, and we'll reconvene sometime in July or August. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.